Hello and welcome to Alex's Model Kits. This is just a quick update talking about the latest work I've been doing on the current kit, which is an Airfix 1/48 scale Bristol Blenheim Mark 1F, and so progress has been going reasonably well on that, and maybe the best thing to do is have a look at what I've done so far. Most aircraft kits start off with the cockpit as the first thing to build. But the Blenheim starts with the main wing spars and the bomb bay, which is a fairly straightforward bit of construction. Once that is completed, then it's time to make a start on the cockpit. The Blenheim has a lot of glasswork surrounding the cockpit, which will probably mean that a lot of the detail within will be on show. So I've decided to spend a bit of time on the cockpit to try and get the best results I can on it. To help with this, I bought a photo etched set of seatbelts for the kit. And to use this, some of the original parts must be modified slightly. The seat needs to have a hole opened up in the plastic. The hole that the seatbelt webbing will be routed through is shown on the part, but remains solid. I've used a small drill and a sharp knife to open up this hole. The seat is then painted. Airfix's instructions suggest using Humbrol number 83, ochre, as the colour for the seat cushion cover. But I've seen photographs of the Blenheim cockpit with a seat cover made of a green hard-wearing vinyl, so I've used Humbrol number 76 uniform green instead. Having painted the seat, I wanted to weather it. These types of seat only have a cushion on the seat back, but nothing on the actual seat. This is because the pilot has his parachute slung low on his body, so when he sits down, he's actually sitting on the parachute, which now doubles as a seat cushion. So I expect that with the movements of the aircraft and the pilot sat on the parachute, this would wear the paint from the bottom of the seat. So I have dry brushed quite a lot of aluminium to show this. I also think that the paint surrounding the hole on the back of the seat would also be worn slightly by the pilot's flying jacket, and so I've added a little aluminium here as well. After that, the photo etched seatbelts were added, and then the seat was attached to the framework that surrounds it to start to build up the cockpit area. So there we are, that's the progress so far. I'm quite pleased with what I've done in terms of getting the cockpit together and using the photo etch. It's the first time I've used photo etch, so I was interested to see how that would work, and generally speaking I'm quite happy with it. I would normally use Tamiya masking tape for seat belts, but I tend to model in 1/72 scale, and I think the seat belts, you can get away with that in that scale, but I think in 1/48 scale probably wouldn't look quite so good. And I have to say I'm very pleased with how they look. They really do look very good indeed, and I'm pleased I bought them, and I would certainly look at buying them again in the future for other 1/48 scale kits. I think they definitely add a quality to the seat itself. I also had a little think about, I've talked about how I weathered the seat and the idea that the parachute would be, as the pilot sits in the seat and adjusts himself, and as the aircraft moves about, the parachute would slide back and forth and from side to side, and that would have an abrasive effect on the paint, and so I weathered that. I did have a little think about how much to weather this kit, mainly because Blenheims were good aircraft. When they first came out, they were recognised as being quite a good aircraft, and unfortunately progress caught up very quickly indeed, and the new version, new models of fighters that came along, things like the 109, the Spitfire and so on, just eclipsed the Blenheim straight away, and so it went from being quite a useful bomber through to being really a bit of a death trap for the crews that flew and fought in it. And so the sad thing is that in those pre-war years 1937, 1938 and early part of 39, they were thought to be okay, and when the reality came to actually use them in combat, It was a rude awakening for the sort of senior command of Bomber Command, and a pretty disastrous series of events for the crews. So the question is really, how much do you weather a Blenheim? Because generally speaking, Blenheims wouldn't survive long enough to weather that much. I'm doing a bit of weathering on this. I think what I'm looking at, what I'm thinking about, is an aircraft that would have come into service around about 1938, would have been flown on training missions, would have been flown on patrols, would have been flown on operational duties, and it would have had a chance to weather down for a while. But I think possibly the Mark IVs, which started coming into service in 1940, I probably would weather those a little less, unless I felt there was a sort of a backstory that gave a reason for why the aircraft was around for a long time. So it's a sad fact, it's a very sad fact. Blenheims really did have a terrible time. Blenheims and Battles, for that matter, had a pretty appalling time, really down to how they were being used, as opposed to how bad the aircraft were. They weren't great aircraft. No aircraft was particularly good in 1939, 1940, and I would say that the Blenheim is, I think, comparable to anything the Germans had in terms of performance. But it's just, I think the difference is that the Luftwaffe had a more comprehensive view. They tended to have air fleets of bombers and fighters which worked more closely together, whereas the RAF tended to have Bomber Command and Fighter Command, and they very much had their own separate missions, and this was pretty disastrous for certainly for the day bombers of Bomber Command, and the Blenheim and the Battle were generally used in day bombing operations, at least initially. So yes, I had a little think about the weathering, and I'm going to do a reasonable amount. I'm not going to over weather it, but I'm not going to make it pristine either. So that's pretty much it. That's the progress so far. I'm quite pleased with it. This is what we have so far, and I'm going to start to sort of just put the rest of the cockpit around it and then build the aircraft up from there. I've also got a masking set. I don't often use masking sets, but I've got a masking set as well, and so I'll have a go with that. I think the next thing to do really is to think about there are some injector pin marks within the fuselage, which are not easy to see, and I probably will, the next thing I'll be looking at will be how to deal with that and get them sorted out, and I probably will talk about that in more detail on the next video. So that is it, I think, for this update. I have got one letter from Mrs. Trellis of North Wales. Dear Quentin of Annex's Model Kits, with the recent information about the coronavirus, a lot of the girls at the Bridge Club have been talking about what they need to stock up on to see through this particular crisis. Can you advise? Yes, certainly, Mrs. Trellis. Very pleased you asked that question. I'm not sure it's a crisis just yet, actually, if I'm honest, but putting that to one side, the idea of self-isolating, I understand that there are people talking about they might be required to self-isolate, but there is no need to really start stocking up for things. Supermarkets will deliver. You're not going to be left on your own, and so the idea of these people that go out and panic buy toilet roll and bags of pasta and tins of beans and everything else, it's a bit of a silly idea in my view, and worse than that, actually, it makes life quite difficult for those who are a little more vulnerable, a little bit in need, those who are maybe a little older and working on pensions and haven't got the time or the money to do this kind of panic buying, and therefore they get left out in the lurch, and they're probably most in need. So really my advice is, if you're going to stock up on anything, stock up on several good books, several good model kits, and a bit of common sense. Okay, well, I hope that helps, Mrs. Trellis, and I look forward to your next letter. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you again soon. Okay, thanks then. Bye.